So does anyone know what day it is today in the US? You might notice from the way I talk that I spent some time in America. Does anyone know what Americans are celebrating right now? Feel free to just, yeah, Thanksgiving, right? Thanksgiving. I'm missing Thanksgiving for this. Thanksgiving, right? My food usually doesn't look this good. If yours does, please invite me to your Thanksgiving as a, transplant American. And when I was younger, growing up in the US, I was told a story that many of us were, which is that Thanksgiving is this beautiful day of gratitude, right? Where the Native Americans and the colonialists got together and shared food, and they had a really good time. You can see them chatting, despite the fact that they didn't speak the same language. And it turns out, as I grew a bit older, I learned that, and this might be shocking to you, but this isn't true. Kind of upsetting. It actually turns out that there was much more strife between these two groups, and in fact, a full-blown genocide. And don't get me started because we can go to Christopher Columbus next. But right, so this was weird to me growing up that this whole thing was actually kind of this alternative reality, right? This misinformation that I pretty firmly believed until I discovered new information. And a lot of this talk is going to be about how do we come to these realities in terms of information that we believe, and how do we update away from misinformation and have an environment where we are actually believing in objective truths rather than these alternative narratives or stories. And you might hope, like I do, and think, oh, well, now, that part of history is behind us, right? Now, Thanksgiving is just this wonderful time where we all sit together and we all believe the same things, and it's also wonderful. But it turns out that isn't true either. So I have to disappoint again, because now it turns out there is still a little bit of strife, and it's usually in the form of your Uncle Jim, who comes to Thanksgiving and tells you that the Democrats are a bunch of pedophilic lizards. So it turns out, and this is amazing data by Chen and Rolla, so not my data to be clear, I wish I'd done the study, where they used geolocation tracking of millions and millions of Americans to look at the amount of time lost during Thanksgiving dinner as a result of politically mismatched families. So they literally tracked people going to Thanksgiving, figured out they had mismatched political families at Thanksgiving dinner table, and how much time they spent together, right? So until when that little geolocation dot goes back home, in a sense, right? And they find that on average, politically mismatched families have around an hour less family dinner, and they control for a bunch of other things, right? So it really is partisanship, or what we would define as loyalty to a political group that is reducing Thanksgiving dinner time. But you might say to me, well, Anton, that's a really cool finding, but it's not that convincing in terms of the dangers of partisanship, right? Who cares if politically mismatched families spend an hour less together? Why? It doesn't matter that much. And so what we wanted to do is show that actually the outcomes of partisanship might be much more severe than spending an hour less over a Thanksgiving turkey. And to do that, we kind of took the same approach as Chen and Rolla, but we looked at a different outcome measure. We looked at physical and social health behaviors during COVID-19 as a function of partisanship, so political group loyalty. And we kind of applied exactly the same approach. So we also used geolocation tracking. So we actually tracked 15 million Americans as a function of political partisanship during COVID-19, and we looked at how much they were social distancing. So how much they were moving around, how much they were visiting businesses that were non-essential, so not grocery stores, right, but like arcades and bars. And we aggregate this data at the US county level, and this is what we find. So we find that on average, Clinton-leaning counties, so counties that voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, showed much more social distancing than counties that voted for Donald Trump. And it's not only general movement, right? This idea of staying home and being safe. It's also visiting non-essential services. So going to places where you might be at risk of infection, right? These are health outcomes. This is not just minutes around a Thanksgiving dinner table. And to kind of stress this even further, because you might say to me, okay, well, It's kind of nuanced, right? There's some difficulties about how much social distancing was really required, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You might say, well, this doesn't, it's somewhat convincing, but I don't know. And I would say to you, yeah, okay, this isn't that unexpected, isn't that shocking when I tell you about this. But what is pretty shocking, at least to me, when I looked at our data, was that partisanship, or whether a county voted for Clinton or Trump, was a 6 times better predictor than the actual rates of COVID-19 in that county, right? The actual infection rate. That is huge. That is enormous, right? 6 times better predictor of what people are doing in terms of their health behaviors than their actual risk of infection where they are. That's crazy. At that point, you can say, right, we are somewhat living in alternative partisan realities, right? Where it isn't the objective truth of the risk of me getting sick and dying that is determining my behavior. It's my political group loyalty in my community, right? That's shocking. Like, we've gone pretty far here, right? And to illustrate also that these partisan alternative realities are immensely dangerous. In our data, we show that these differences in social distancing, driven by political in-group, right, predicted greater subsequent fatalities in pro-Trump counties after accounting for things like demographics, right, density, infection rate, all these kind of things. So literally, because of partisanship, political group loyalty, and these alternative realities of, oh, COVID doesn't exist, more people die, like death, right? Life and death. These are pretty important outcomes. I don't think we can get any more important than that, can we? And so given these risks, this kind of started an area or a line of research where I started to ask, okay, well, we see these problems, but in terms of trying to solve them, one of the first questions is, where do these political realities come from? Where do these partisan alternative realities actually come from? And because I'm a professor in the Department of Leadership and Organizational Behavior, right? One of the first kind of ideas that came to my head is political leaders, of course, right? They're the ones that create these narratives, at least in part. They're the ones making the claims that we respond to, right? Trump was the one saying, oh, this virus will be over in a week. Don't worry about it, right? And often historically, we've seen that the most convincing, right? The most widespread kind of alternative realities, these partisan realities that go away from objective truth and fact, have been led by nationalist, fascist leaders, right? And I think this is beautifully summed up in this quote by Hannah Arendt in The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she wrote that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, so the reality of the experience, no longer exists. And so, based off of this idea, right, there's this hypothesis or theory that political leaders can create alternative realities by peddling falsehoods in a population. And those realities have significant consequences. But let's actually test this. So to do this, we created a large language model that actually reliably and validly quantifies the degree of assertive falsehoods in leaders' rhetoric. And what I mean by that is it literally quantifies the degree to which political leaders are lying, making false claims, right? Communicating falsehoods with certainty, right? Framing falsehoods as facts. And by the way, this is open source. I can share it with you. You can use it in your research. It's pretty cool. It can also be used for any kind of natural language, by the way. It doesn't have to be leaders specifically. And we used our large language model to quantify basically assertive falsehoods, or the rate of falsehoods in US presidential speeches, around 800 different speeches. And then we split those into little excerpts. So our model evaluated around 26,000 presidential speech excerpts. So those are a couple sentences in a speech for the degree of assertive falsehoods in that excerpt. I'll give you an example of this so you can kind of get a feel for it. So one of these excerpts in our data is this claim by Donald Trump from the State of the Union address in 2019, where he said, lawmakers in New York cheered with delight upon the passage of legislation that would allow a baby to be ripped from the mother's womb moments before birth. This is fundamentally untrue, by the way. I don't even think we need the LLM to tell us that. our LLM evaluates these statements on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is very low in falsehood and 7 is very high. And it kind of nails this one. It also gives an explanation of its rating. So our LLM tells us that this has a score of 7, so 7 out of 7, and says and explains this statement, this score, by saying the statement reflects a very high degree of falsehood. It asserts extreme and inflammatory claims that are not supported by real-world evidence. This is just one example. We went through a lot of these different excerpts to make sure that our LLM is reliably responding correctly, and that is. So the first thing we did with this really cool new tool we have, right? Because now we can quantify really just thousands of excerpts and speeches and political leaders, is we looked at whether US presidential rhetoric had changed over time and as a function of political party. And we find something fairly striking, in my opinion, which is that Republican and Democratic leaders, as in presidents, kind of had the same rate of communicating falsehoods as facts up until Reagan's election, at which point you kind of see a divergence where Republican leaders are much more likely to embrace falsehoods and false narratives in their speeches and in their rhetoric. Maybe it is not a coincidence that Reagan's 1980s slogan was "Let's make America great again." We can also look at this in terms of individual presidents. And I think what will immediately stick out to you is how much Donald Trump is an outlier in this. Seems fairly obvious if you listen to him speak even once. However, I just want to stress how huge that is in terms of an outlier, right? If you look at those tiny little bars around some of those dots, those are standard errors, right? This is a huge effect, right? It's not just correlation of 0.2. This is enormous, right? And he really is like significantly, very, very significantly, if we're going to talk about statistics, shows a higher use of asserted falsehoods than any other president. This is not business as usual. It is not a small change in politics. It is a seismic shift. So let's go back a second though and say, okay, Anton, that's all very interesting. However, maybe you're just having a bit of a moral panic about this, right? About misinformation and these false claims, right? Oftentimes, we share false claims, we laugh at them, we think it's kind of humorous, right? Oh, he said that, I can't believe that, right? But does it actually matter? Does it actually influence people's beliefs, people's attitudes, and behaviors, right? Does it actually matter? And so our next question was kind of to try and figure that out, right? Does the use of assertive falsehoods, do these falsehoods in presidential rhetoric, in leader rhetoric, do they actually predict subsequent harmful outcomes? And specifically what we did is we focused on political violence, right? Based on the idea that if you create this alternative reality, this partisan alternative reality, right, that may lead downstream to political violence, as we saw in those nationalistic leaders historically, right? And so we test this, and the way we test this is we look at if the degree of assertive falsehoods or these false claims in presidential speeches in a specific year predict an increase in political violence the following year. And that's what we find. So on the x-axis, right, it's the degree of using those falsehoods in a specific year. So each dot is a year from 1850 to around 2014, sorry. And that predicts a subsequent rise in violent political events the next year, right? So the rhetoric presidents use in their speeches in 1 year predicts an increase in violent political events, such as riots, mobs, assassination attempts, lynchings, if we go back in time, right? These are pretty serious outcomes. Just to provide some context for these findings, let's take Donald Trump, right, given the outlier status, and let's compare him with Joe Biden. If we do that in our data, our model predicts that Trump's rhetoric compared to Biden's, in terms of asserted falsehoods, in terms of these false claims, predicts a twofold increase in violent political events per year. Again, that's enormous, right? That's not just, a couple more, that is a doubling. And this very much aligns with that during Trump's tenure, during his first term, there was a massive spike in political violence that actually went right back down to normal almost when Biden took over. These are just correlational results, right? You might say, oh, there's so many confounds, that's problematic. So we ran an experimental study. So what we did is we had our large language model quantify excerpts from the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. And I'll give you an example of one of the excerpts that our LLM qualified as being high in falsehood. So this is kind of the classic, the Haitian migrants are eating dogs. And yeah, 100%, right? I laugh too. But does it actually have harmful consequences, right? And so what we did is we had hundreds of participants read statements like this that were rated as high in falsehood, but also other statements that were just kind of general policy statements that our model rated as being very low falsehood. And this is what we find. So we find an increase in terms of support for political violence. So this is an experimental study, right? So literally reading these types of falsehoods increases Americans' support for political violence, right? So statements like, oh, violence might be necessary in today's political climate, things like that. We also find some evidence to, or another variable to try and explain this a little bit. So we find that these assertive falsehoods, like the pet eating falsehood, also increase political polarization. So that means kind of negative attitudes towards the political outgroup, right? And that in part may help explain why this is increasing support for political violence. I think these findings can, in part, help to explain what happened on January 6th, right? This was very much driven by what has been nicknamed Trump's big lie, as in that the election in 2020 was stolen. And also notably, in our data, which is slightly unlike past work in political violence, we find that the effects of these falsehoods on support for political violence go across demographics. So they're true for people across age, across gender, whether people are employed or not. And this can kind of help explain why the insurrectionists on January 6th were so diverse, right? A lot of them were middle-aged, had jobs, things like that. And that is very atypical, by the way, for political violence, right? Most of these people didn't have a history of mental illness. They didn't have a criminal record. This is a different form of political violence. One that, at least to me, is driven by these alternative partisan realities and not by fringe conspiracy beliefs or kind of these, QAnon kind of beliefs, right? And not to say that there are some exceptions to the rule, like the lovely gentleman in the middle with his horns. Right? I don't think I need to tell you really that if we're going to try and change this, it is very difficult to intervene at the level of the political leader, right? I don't think I'm writing a grant anytime soon that says my plan is to hang out with Donald Trump and convince him to be more honest. Right? And so we kind of shifted and said, okay, well, if we're going to try to change this, let's go to a different level. And the level we chose to move towards is saying, okay, well, political leaders might claim these falsehoods, but maybe once they're then in the ethos, we can try to attenuate their spread, right? If they don't spread to as many people, then maybe we can reduce these alternative partisan realities. And one way to do this is to look at kind of intervention studies. And so we conducted a large-scale intervention on misinformation sharing. So in this study, participants basically see tons of headlines, some of which are fake, like the one on the left, and some of which are true, like the one on the right. And they basically decide whether to share or not share this content in a simulated social media environment. And the question is, how can you get people to share less fake content and potentially also share more true content? And there's a number of different interventions that have been looked at in the literature. So things like accuracy prompts, where the idea is to draw people's attention towards the importance of accuracy, which leads them, assumably, to share more accurate news. Things like warning labels, these are often used by social media companies, right? Like, this has been checked by an independent fact checker and it's fake. Things like nudges, so you can tell people that it's really a norm that 98% of people believe you should share accurate news. And also things like boosting interventions, like media literacy tips, which are basically, there's only 2 up here, but there's like a bunch, which are basically little tips to be able to figure out what is fake and true, to kind of help you identify fake news. This is what we find. No treatment control, basically, this is just indicating that people share a bit less true and false news as the study goes on. That's it. But we can use that no treatment control to compare to the efficacy of our other interventions. It actually turns out we find accuracy prompts not to really work. That was a bit surprising because there's a lot of research showing that they work. We dug into this a bit, and it turns out we find a fairly similar effect size. It just turns out that most past intervention studies on accuracy prompts have thousands and thousands and thousands of people in them. But that's exactly the importance of doing a study like this, is to compare many different interventions and figure out the comparative effect sizes, right? Warning labels work like crazy, right? They work very well at reducing false news sharing. This should not be surprising. They're really on the nose, right? It's literally, a transparent overlay saying that it was checked and it's false. Social norms kind of work, but I think most importantly, media literacy tips are just as effective as warning labels. I find that pretty striking, again, because warning labels are just so on the nose, right? For every false news item, after the intervention, we have this warning label. Of course, you're going to share less of it, right? But the media literacy tips are just as effective. They're also the only intervention that increased the sharing of true news. So I think there's a lot of potential there for this type of intervention. We also created this neat little Shiny app, which is publicly online, where you can move around demographics. And our app will tell you which intervention is most effective for those demographics. This is pretty neat, right? Because now you can look at subpopulations. So for instance, right now here, it's set to like older age and conservative. We know from past literature that older conservatives are at risk for sharing false news, especially on things like Facebook and stuff like that. So our little app can tell you which interventions are perhaps most effective for that subgroup that is at risk. And you can mess around with this any way you want. So if you're looking at a different group that you're interested in, you can change it to that, which I think is quite neat. So I think this is kind of encouraging, right? There are some ways that we can reduce the spread of false information and maybe even increase the spread of accurate information. But there are a lot of issues with these types of interventions. One is just simply scalability, right? I can't run around all day and read media literacy tips to people. It's gonna be a bit tough, right? And there's also, once these things start to get introduced, there's also sometimes reactants. So here somebody is posting, how do you block fact checkers? I'm so sick of this crap popping up on everything. And somebody says like, how about just posting the truth, right? But like right now, even conservatives kind of trust these independent fact checker labels. But as the alternative partisan reality evolves, I would not be surprised if they start to ignore these things, right? So that's an issue. There are some better solutions. There are actually machine learning algorithms that are pretty good at accurately quantifying or classifying news as fake or not, or information as fake or not. We don't use these, and we don't really talk about this, which I find very strange. So we just kind of ignore that these things exist, right? We use spam filters, right? Those are machine learning algorithms. Why wouldn't we use this? You can also ban repeat offenders. There's some really great research showing that the majority of misinformation posted online is actually driven by a very small number of users. Like I think you can look at it, it's like a couple hundred are responsible for like 80% or something like that. That's pretty shocking, right? This seems like a much better solution than giving everyone media literacy tips. It's just ban those people, right? Turns out though, social media companies don't really want to do this. Turns out these posts are good for ad revenue. They spread, they keep people engaged, they cause moral outrage, which equals money in the end. Some social media companies have even just leaned in. X, formerly known as Twitter, RIP, now basically is actively engaged in creating misinformation content, with Elon posting I don't know how many false statements a day. So I mean, we're at a point where regulatory and policy changes are probably the only thing that could stop the spread of misinformation. So this is all to say it's quite difficult to change the misinformation ecosystem. We're not going to have that much luck with this as researchers and as people who care, I think. And so we hit another roadblock. And again, our little research team decided to jump to a different level. So what we said is, okay, well, if we can't change what the political leaders say, and if we can't really change the misinformation ecosystem, what if we just go one level lower and we say, what if we try to change the harmful outcomes of falsehoods or false beliefs, right? So, we're getting closer into the corner and the corner and the corner, right? At some point, I'm just standing in the corner saying, it's okay, you can hold your false beliefs, but just don't act on them, right? Just keep them in your mind, don't do anything silly, right? And so we developed this little theoretical model to try and figure out when false beliefs lead to antisocial outcomes. And so the idea here is that if you hold a belief, and by the way, it doesn't really matter what domain the belief is in. So this theory is kind of domain general. So it could be, an anti-vaccine belief. It could be the belief that the election was rigged. It could be that Bob, your coworker, secretly hates you. It doesn't really matter, right? It can just be any kind of belief that you hold. And what we say in this model is that if you hold a belief with something we call misplaced certainty, then you experience higher levels of threat, and that in turn increases antisocial behavior. I'll explain to you what misplaced certainty is. So misplaced certainty we conceptualize as holding a belief with certainty. So, and I want to really stress certainty here. It really means like felt knowledge, right? That you almost feel like completely certain that this is true, like it's true, right? So you don't really have room for doubt. And then we combine that certainty in a belief with perceived opposition towards the belief. And this can be opposition in terms of that you think other people are denying the belief, right? But it can also be, a fear that there isn't really evidence to back up your belief, right? So for instance, let's say I, have like an anti-vaccine belief. Let's say I think, vaccines cause autism. And I feel that as like felt knowledge. Like I'm really certain about that. But I know out there, right, there aren't that many scientific articles to back me up. Experts don't agree with me, right? And then also, like, there's a huge part of the population that doesn't agree with me, right? Now I'm starting to hold that belief in terms of what we call misplaced certainty. So just to kind of summarize that, the epistemic structure of misplaced certainty would be like, I am certain of X, where X is some belief, but X lacks evidence and or is judged by others as unknowable or wrong, right? So I am certain that vaccines cause autism, but lacks a bit of evidence in the sense that, if I'm being honest with myself, more articles say that this isn't true than that it is true, and most other people seem to deny that truth. Now, this leads to a really weird, interesting state, right? Because in a sense, I have this felt knowledge and I feel kind of special, right? Because I have this knowledge of something that can't really be known, and so I'm kind of privileged, right? I'm kind of like so cool because I have this knowledge. But at the same time, everyone seems to be trying to take this away from me, right? They're denying my truth, my reality. And that, we hypothesize, is very threatening, as in it will make me experience epistemic threat. You're trying to take away, that warm bathtub, which is that feeling of knowledge and certainty that I have in something. And in turn, as we know from really old school literature, right, threat can very much lead to a fight response. And in our context, this would include antisocial behavior like aggression, political violence, these types of outcomes that we're trying to avoid. So we actually have done a ton of studies on this, kind of backing up this theoretical model. So we have a bunch of empirical support for this. I'll show you one example of a study, just so you can kind of get a feel for what the data usually look like. So threat here is on the y-axis. Well-placed certainty is a little different from misplaced certainty. We use it as a control condition. And what it basically is I have certainty in something, but I think most people agree with me and there is evidence to back it up, right? So let's say I have, a belief in climate change. I feel really certain that climate change is a problem. It turns out most scientists agree. And actually, the majority of Americans do actually agree with this. I think it's like over 70%, right? So I don't feel that threat. Now, I feel the threat of climate change, of course, but I don't feel the threat of like other people are trying to take away this felt knowledge of mine, right? And as a result, I don't feel very threatened, right? And that's what we find. Misplaced belief is another control condition. So this is basically, yeah, it's misplaced. I think other people, don't agree with me on my belief, but I'm not certain about my belief. So let's say I think vaccines cause autism, right? I think, oh, other people deny my belief. They don't agree with me, but I myself am not completely certain, right? I kind of think I have a suspicion vaccines cause autism, but I'm not at the level of certainty, right? And then finally, we have misplaced certainty. And we can see that on average, right, in these studies, we continually find that holding a belief in misplaced certainty leads to the highest response of threat. And again, we've done this across like many different domains. So these can be health beliefs, interpersonal beliefs, religious beliefs, political beliefs, right? We find the same consistent results. And then finally, in line with our model, we find the similar results for antisocial outcomes like aggression, support for political violence, these types of things. And we also find that the level of threat directly predicts these antisocial outcomes. So based on this theoretical model, and kind of in line with like the whole point of all of this, in terms of trying to develop interventions to reduce these alternative realities, really, we tested a number of different interventions to see if we can reduce, right, attenuate these antisocial outcomes of false beliefs. One strategy we've tried a couple times is like a cognitive reappraisal strategy. So this involves changing how one thinks about a situation to alter its emotional impact. So what we're trying to do here, right, is we're really trying to reduce that feeling of threat, right? We're targeting the threat. If you reimagine the situation, maybe that will feel less threatening. So for instance, let's say, again, the vaccine's autism, misplaced certainty that I have, let's say, right? If I ask you to reimagine that and I say, oh, well, these other people that you think are denying your certainty, right? Maybe just, think about how you should recognize that like people have different beliefs and that's okay, right? And that they're not trying to hurt you, they just disagree. Maybe they'll come around to your way of thinking eventually, right? Things like that. That can reduce threat. And so in this data that I showed you, we actually included a cognitive reappraisal condition. So this is basically misplaced certainty, like the example I just gave you, but then we tell you to reflect on or try to come up with ways to reduce your feeling of threat. And this is effective in terms of reducing threat. But it's also effective downstream in terms of reducing actual aggression and antisocial outcomes. So it seems to work in a sense, right? Now, maybe telling people, everyone's going to come to your side and agree with you in the end is not the greatest type of intervention. And so we also have tested other things like superordinate goals. So this involves kind of individuals of conflicting groups recognizing their shared goals and values. So remember the debate study that I told you about a little bit ago? I actually hid a third condition from you. I'm sorry. And in that condition, what we had is after participants read the assertive falsehoods, like the pet eating falsehood that Trump said, we had them reflect on how Americans on average, right, have superordinate goals, right? They want America to be a prosperous society with opportunities, right? Maybe they think there's different ways to get there, but on average, right, we all kind of want the same thing. This is quite effective in terms of turning off support for political violence and aggression. So there are some ways that we can kind of intervene on the pathway from holding a false belief to actual antisocial outcomes that seem to be effective. So a couple takeaways. The first thing that I kind of, and what is basically the theme of the talk is these alternative partisan realities exist and they're much more severe than you think they are. I know there's sometimes research indicating like, oh, America is less polarized than you think and da-da-da-da-da. But at the same time, if we're getting outcomes like partisanship is 6 times stronger as a predictor of how people acted during COVID when the risks are amazingly severe than actual COVID infection rates in one's community, that to me indicates a pretty big problem. And these consequences are not only the COVID behaviors, but as I showed you also literal political violence as a result of these kind of falsehoods being peddled by political leaders. Political leaders fuel these alternative realities, and in particular, US Republican leaders have shifted towards embracing falsehoods in the last 20, 30 years, which is pretty problematic. Again, it is not business as usual. Again, it is not just 2 parties arguing against each other. It is one party creating an alternative reality that does not exist. We wanted to pivot a little bit, right? Because we can't change what leaders say. So we moved towards targeting the misinformation when it exists, right? How it spreads. Can we stop people from sharing this content? And we do find some support that warning labels and media literacy tips can reduce misinformation spread. But if we're really being honest with ourselves, right, the companies that control these platforms have much bigger ability to actually reduce these problems and are currently unwilling to do so, at least on average. So again, we had to pivot. And finally, we talked a little bit about how we can limit the harm of false beliefs if we can't stop their spread by preventing people from actually acting on them, right? So these actual antisocial outcomes like aggression, like January 6th, right? Like political violence. And I want to kind of leave you with the paradox of tolerance by Karl Popper. And the idea is as follows. It's basically like, if we extend tolerance to intolerance in society, then our tolerant society will be destroyed. So basically the idea is we cannot be tolerant of intolerance in our societies. We must be intolerant of intolerance. And I think for a very long time, we haven't been doing this, and it's catching up to us, right? We're seeing many different elections where alt-right governments and parties are gaining power, right? And I think we're kind of paying the price for too long for kind of going along with this idea of, oh, it's free speech. That person's allowed to say intolerant things. That person's allowed to say anti-democratic things. It's free speech, it's free speech. But in the end, I think Karl is right, and that ultimately this might destroy us. And if we're thinking about this in terms of the context of misinformation and false beliefs, I think, again, for too long, we've kind of fallen into the trap of treating misinformation as free speech, as tolerating misinformation and falsehoods, and these alternative realities, despite, and I think hopefully I've convinced you of this, that they have a huge impact for harm. And in some cases, to be very honest, I think we're a bit too late. I think in the US, right, the fox is in the hen house. At this point, if we start regulating misinformation, that's not going to work, right? Because who's going to regulate it like the foxes in the hen house, right? But weirdly enough, like we regulate a lot of things in society, right? We regulate the agriculture industry. We regulate the products you buy. We regulate how you drive your car, right? Because these all have the potential for harm. If misinformation and falsehoods have also a huge potential for harm, as I've shown you, I don't understand why we are so resistant to regulating them, as long as, right, the tolerant government is still in place. And that's it. Thanks so much. This is pure advertising to learn more about this stuff. Buy a QR code to my website.